The commander's voice cut through the sealed briefing room like a blade drawn across silence. I need someone cleared for black operations. Chairs creaked as bodies shifted, breath caught and held. Before my mind could process the weight of what he was asking, my body made the decision. I stood. A short, sharp laugh broke the tension. My father's. It wasn't cruel. Not intentionally. It was the sound of a man so certain of his understanding of the world that surprise manifested as reflex, as protection against the impossible. Sit down, Catherine. The words came loud enough for the entire room to hear. Loud enough to carry the full weight of his authority even in retirement. You don't belong here. You don't have the qualifications for that. Captain Reeves turned toward me, his expression neutral, professional. The fluorescent lights caught the silver at his temples as he waited. Call sign? I met his eyes without hesitation, without raising my voice, without needing to prove anything beyond the simple truth, Shadow 9. The room didn't gasp. That's not how these spaces work. But the air changed, a shift so subtle that only those who lived in these worlds would recognize it. Recognition moved through the assembled officers like an electrical current finding its path, invisible but undeniable. My father stopped breathing. I saw it in my peripheral vision even as I maintained eye contact with Captain Reeves. Admiral Robert Mitchell, retired, 72 years of certainty, suddenly confronting a reality that didn't fit into any of the carefully organized compartments he'd built his life around. In that moment, watching his chest freeze mid-rise, his hands tighten on the armrests of his chair until the knuckles went white, I understood something I'd been too close to see before. He had never known his own daughter, not because I'd hidden who I was, but because he'd never thought to ask. I need to go back now. Nothing about that moment makes sense without the years that came before it, without understanding how a father and daughter could stand in the same room for 38 years and remain strangers. I grew up in a house where everything had its designated place, and everyone had their assigned role. My father believed in order the way some men believe in faith or fate, as the organizing principle that kept chaos at bay. Shoes lined by the door in perfect rows, flags folded with military precision on the mantel, voices kept to appropriate volumes. He'd served the Navy for 35 years and carried those decades into retirement like a second spine, like something that had fused with his skeleton and couldn't be removed even if he'd wanted to try. The house in San Diego reflected this. Clean lines, neutral colors, furniture arranged for function rather than comfort. My mother adapted to it the way water adapts to the shape of its container, filling the spaces left to her, making softness where she could within the rigid parameters. Derek, my brother, fit into that world the way a key fits a lock it was designed for. He was loud where I learned to be careful, confident in spaces where I learned to hesitate. When he brought home trophies from high school sports or talked about enlisting, our father's eyes lit in a way I never saw directed toward me. Not with meanness. Admiral Robert Mitchell wasn't a cruel man. He simply had a template in his mind for what leadership looked like, what strength sounded like, what a worthy successor to his legacy would embody. Derek matched that template. I existed outside its parameters. The comparisons started early, though I don't think my father recognized them as such. To him, they were observations, statements of fact. Derek's a natural leader. Catherine's thoughtful. Derek has the right instincts for command. Catherine pays attention to details. Praise delivered in categories, in qualifications that made clear which traits mattered more. Thanksgiving dinner, 1998. I was 15 years old, sitting at the table while Derek's varsity football jersey hung on the back of his chair like a trophy. Number 7 in blue and gold. My father had placed it there himself, centering it so everyone could see. "This is a real Mitchell," he'd said, his voice swelling with pride he made no effort to contain. Derek grinned, soaking it in while my mother served turkey and sweet potatoes. In my backpack, tucked into the zippered pocket where I kept things I didn't want crushed, was a letter. I'd been selected to represent our school at the National Math Olympiad, one of 50 students nationwide. The envelope had arrived 3 days earlier. I'd read it alone in my room, felt a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy, and then spent the next 72 hours watching for the right moment to share it. But sitting there, watching my father's face glow as he talked about Derek's touchdown in the homecoming game, about the scouts who'd been asking questions, about the future he could see stretching out in front of his son like a red carpet already rolled out and waiting. I understood there was no right moment. There was only the reality that some achievements created space for celebration, while others barely registered as worth mentioning. I never told them about the math Olympiad. The letter stayed in my backpack until the event passed, until the moment became just another thing I'd accomplished alone. My mother noticed. I know she did because one morning a few weeks later, I found a note on my pillow. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart." It was written in her careful script on a piece of notepaper decorated with watercolor flowers. She never asked what she was proud of. The vagueness felt like its own kind of pain, like being acknowledged for something too small or too distant to name specifically. High school graduation, 2005, valedictorian, perfect 4.0 GPA across 4 years, no behavioral incidents, no absences, no failures of any kind. Derek graduated the same day with a 3.1 and no particular honors, but the celebration that night was entirely his. My father invited colleagues from his Navy days, set up a barbecue in the backyard, played Bruce Springsteen too loud. My son's joining the service, going to serve his country like his old man. I waited until the burgers were gone, and half the guests had left before mentioning that I'd also been accepted to the Naval Academy at Annapolis. Not just accepted, offered an academic scholarship that covered everything. My father nodded without looking up from the cooler where he was organizing empty beer bottles for recycling. Good. You'll learn discipline. That helps in any career. That was the sum total of his response. 4 sentences about Derek's plans, 4 words about mine. My mother's reaction cut deeper because it came wrapped in concern. "Catherine, honey, are you sure? The Navy's so hard for girls. Maybe you'd be happier at a regular college, somewhere closer to home?" The implication settled like sediment. I wasn't capable. I wasn't suited. I was making a choice based on desperation or confusion, rather than genuine aptitude. Derek's path into the military was destiny. Mine was deviation. I stopped trying to explain after that, stopped waiting for the conversations to go differently. Some lessons you learn once and carry forever, that exhaustion comes not from working hard, but from working hard while invisible, from achieving things that dissolve the moment they pass through someone else's perception of who you're allowed to be. The only person who seemed to understand was Grandmother Mitchell, my father's mother. She came to my graduation alone because my grandfather had died 2 years earlier from complications following a stroke. 78 years old, wearing a navy blue dress and pearls, carrying a bouquet of white roses that she pressed into my hands before the ceremony started. "Catherine, I see you." Her voice was soft but clear, cutting through the noise of families gathering and cameras clicking. "Don't let them make you invisible. Silence isn't weakness. It's strength they haven't learned to recognize yet." I hugged her hard enough that she laughed, patting my back. "That's my girl. You go show them what a Mitchell really looks like." She died 6 months later, cancer that had been growing quietly for years, that she'd known about but hadn't mentioned to anyone until it was too late for intervention to matter. I flew home for the funeral during my first semester at Annapolis, stood in the rain at the cemetery, while my father gave a eulogy about duty and service and sacrifice. He didn't mention that she'd been the one who taught him how to fold a flag properly, that she'd worked as a codebreaker during World War II, that she'd been brilliant in ways the military of her era hadn't known what to do with. I kept the roses from graduation pressed between the pages of my tactics textbook. They turned brown and brittle, but I couldn't bring myself to throw them away. Annapolis was different in ways I hadn't expected. Harder, yes. The physical demands alone weeded out a significant percentage of the class before Christmas, but also clearer. Performance was measured, recorded, and then ranked. You either met standards or you didn't. There was still prejudice, still the assumption that women were temporary placeholders who'd wash out or get pregnant or discover they weren't cut out for this after all. But there was also proof, test scores, fitness assessments, navigation exercises, things that couldn't be dismissed as easily as potential or instinct or fit. I finished my plebe year ranked 7th in a class of 1,200, made the superintendent's list both semesters, got selected for the Advanced Naval Intelligence track during youngster year. When I went home for Christmas break in 2006, Derek was there with his new girlfriend Ashley. My mother had decorated the house the way she did every year. Lights on the eaves, a wreath on the door, a tree in the living room weighted down with ornaments collected across decades. Everything looked the same, but felt subtly different, like I was visiting a museum of my own childhood rather than actually returning to it. Derek and Ashley took up space naturally, sprawling on the couch, laughing at inside jokes, making plans for New Year's Eve that involved people I didn't know. My father gravitated toward them, asking questions about Derek's training, about his scores at boot camp, about what he thought he wanted to specialize in. I tried to talk about the tactical simulations we'd been running, about the way modern naval warfare was evolving in response to asymmetric threats. My father cut me off mid-sentence. Derek, you thinking about submarines or surface warfare? The conversation pivoted without acknowledgement that I'd been speaking, like a river finding the path of least resistance around a stone. Ashley noticed. She had that quality some people have of seeing social dynamics the way others see colors or hear music. Later, when Derek and my father were outside grilling steaks despite the December chill, she sat down next to me in the kitchen, where I was helping my mother with side dishes. So what do you study at the academy? Her tone was genuine, curious, rather than just polite. Intelligence analysis, strategic communications, regional conflict dynamics. I kept my voice neutral, not wanting to sound like I was showing off. Right now, we're focusing on Middle Eastern geopolitical structures and how they interface with naval operations. That sounds really interesting. Ashley stirred sugar into her coffee, watching me. Derek mentioned you're near the top of your class. It was such a small thing, acknowledgement that I was good at something that mattered, but it lodged in my chest like a piece of glass. Painful not because it hurt, but because it highlighted how rare it was, how much I'd learned to live without it. Before I could respond, Derek came back inside, cold air rushing in with him. Babe, you want your steak medium or medium well? He didn't ask me. Had already assumed he knew, or more likely hadn't thought to wonder. The pattern repeated across breaks and holidays, across years. My sophomore year, I made Dean's List. Derek got engaged. My junior year, I was selected for a summer intensive in cryptologic warfare. Derek and Ashley set a wedding date. My senior year, I graduated with distinction. Derek had a son. Each milestone in my life existed in the margins of celebrations for his. I wasn't jealous. That's not quite the right word. Derek hadn't done anything wrong. He was living his life, achieving things worth celebrating. The problem wasn't him. It was that space only seemed to exist for one kind of achievement at a time, one kind of story, and mine was written in a font too small for anyone to read. Without effort, they weren't willing to expend. 2 months before graduation from Annapolis, Commander Margaret Chen called me into her office. She was 45 years old, one of the few women of Asian descent in naval special operations. Compact and precise in her movements, in a way that reminded me of my grandmother. She'd been watching me, she said, had noticed things. You have a particular quality, Catherine. She didn't soften it with qualifiers or compliments designed to make the observation more palatable. Most officers want to be seen, want credit, recognition, advancement tied to visible achievement. You're different. You do excellent work and then you disappear, like you're training yourself to be invisible. I didn't know how to respond to that. Didn't know if it was criticism or insight or something else entirely. Commander Chen pulled a manila envelope from her desk drawer. This is an invitation to selection, Tactical Operations Division. It's an 18-month program. 92% of candidates fail. If you pass, you'll be removed from standard personnel records. Your family won't be able to know what you do or where you deploy. You'll have clearances that supersede standard chain of command visibility. You'll become, essentially, a ghost. She slid the envelope across the desk. The seal was already broken. She'd read it before calling me in. I know why I chose you for recommendation. The question is whether you know. I looked at the envelope, at the official letterhead visible through the opening. I've been invisible my whole life. The words came out before I could decide whether to say them. I'm good at it. Commander Chen smiled, but it was a sad smile, the kind that comes from recognition of something that shouldn't be true, but is. That's exactly why. Most people would need to learn how to operate without ego, without the need for external validation. You've already been trained. You just didn't know that's what was happening. I took the envelope. Didn't open it there in her office, didn't ask questions about what selection would entail, or what my chances were, or what came after. If I made it through, some decisions you make before you understand them, before you have language for what you're choosing or why. The invitation was for a program that started 3 weeks after graduation. I'd have to decline my commission in standard naval intelligence, commit to something I couldn't discuss with anyone, step into a version of service that had no public face and no visible markers of success. I said yes within 24 hours. There were 2 graduation ceremonies. The public one happened on a bright May afternoon with thousands of family members in attendance, bagpipes and dress uniforms and speeches about duty and honor. Derek brought Ashley and their infant son. My parents sat in the bleachers, my father in his old uniform, despite the extra weight he carried now, my mother wearing a hat to keep the sun off. They clapped when my name was called, took photos afterward, went to dinner at a seafood restaurant near the harbor. The private ceremony happened 3 days earlier in a windowless conference room with 11 other newly commissioned officers and a handful of senior personnel whose names we were told once and expected to forget. No families, no cameras, no certificates suitable for framing, just a brief acknowledgement that we'd been selected for something most of our peers would never know existed, that we were about to step into roles that required we erase ourselves from the story, even as we helped write it. Commander Chen stood in the back of the room during that ceremony. When it was over and the others had filed out, she stopped me. This is the last time I'll be able to openly acknowledge your achievements. So I want to say it now, while I can. You're one of the best officers I've trained. What you're about to do matters more than most people will ever understand. I'm proud of you. I managed to hold it together until I got back to my dorm room. Then I sat on the edge of my bed and cried. Not from sadness exactly, but from the strange grief of being seen clearly and knowing that clarity was about to become classified. At the public graduation dinner, my father raised a glass to Derek and Catherine, both serving their country, making the Mitchell name proud. Derek beamed. I smiled. No one asked what I'd actually be doing, where I'd be stationed, what my role would entail. My mother mentioned that her friend Linda's daughter had just gotten engaged. Ashley showed off photos of the baby. The conversation moved on like water around a stone, like I'd already left even though I was still sitting there. Selection was everything Commander Chen had implied, and worse than I'd imagined. 18 months compressed into a kind of time that didn't match calendar days, where weeks dissolved into endurance and stress positions and scenarios designed to break you in ways that left no visible marks. The 92% failure rate wasn't exaggeration. People quit in the first month, the first week, sometimes the first day when they understood what they'd actually volunteered for. I didn't quit. Not out of stubbornness or pride, but because this was the first place where my particular shape, the quietness my father had mistaken for lack of ambition, the careful observation my family had read as disengagement, was exactly what was needed. They were training us to disappear, to operate in spaces where visibility meant failure or death. I'd been disappearing my whole life. This was just learning to do it on purpose. My first deployment came 6 months after completing selection. I wrote home on a postcard. Everything's fine. Work keeps me busy. Love you all. The truth, I spent 8 months in the Horn of Africa, supporting counterterrorism operations in a capacity I still can't detail. I carried an M18 pistol with no identifying marks, wore civilian clothes that could have belonged to an aid worker or a journalist or a missionary, slept in rooms that changed every few days, learned what it felt like to be 23 years old and responsible for information that could save lives or end them depending on whether I got the analysis right. When I came home for Christmas 2010, I'd lost 15 pounds I couldn't afford to lose. My skin was darker from sun and wind, my eyes carrying something my mother noticed but didn't name. You look tired, honey. Are you eating enough? Derek was there with Ashley and their son, now 3 years old and loud in the way toddlers are, demanding attention and receiving it gladly. My father asked general questions. You staying busy? They treating you right? I said yes and yes because the truth didn't fit into the kind of conversation we knew how to have. Because explaining would require them to first believe I was doing something worth explaining, and that foundation had never been laid. The distance grew from there, widening with each deployment. each holiday I missed or arrived too late to fully participate in. Derek got promoted, had a second child, bought a house. His life accumulated visible markers of progress, rank insignia, family photos, mortgage statements, all the evidence that he was building something real and substantial. My life accumulated things I couldn't talk about, clearances that went higher than my father had ever held, commendations for operations that had no public record, a reputation in circles so small and specialized that most military personnel would never encounter them, and a growing understanding that I'd made a choice, not wrong, but irrevocable, to value internal knowing over external recognition. 2015. I was 29 years old when I received my official call sign. Commander Chen, now Captain Chen, delivered it personally during a brief layover in Virginia, where our schedules happened to intersect. Shadow 9. She said it like it was a name and an assessment both. You're the 9th person in the history of this program with the specific skill set we're designating. You go in, complete the objective, and exit without anyone knowing you were there. Perfect operational invisibility. Is that a compliment? I meant it as a joke, but it came out flat, exhausted. Captain Chen's expression softened. It's a recognition of reality. Some people are weapons. Some people are shields. You're something rarer. You're a ghost that gets things done. The world needs ghosts. I wanted to ask if ghosts ever got to stop being invisible. If there was a point where you could be both effective and seen. But I already knew the answer. You don't get both. You choose. Back home in San Diego, my father had retired from his consulting work. My mother had left nursing to focus on what she called family time, which mostly meant being available for Derek's kids. They'd bought an RV, talked about taking trips to national parks, about finally having time to relax. When I called to say I'd be in town for a few days between assignments, my mother sounded surprised. Oh, that's nice. But honey, we actually have Bob and Linda staying here this week. They're family friends of your father's from his Navy days. The house is full. Would you mind staying at a hotel? Derek offered as an afterthought. You could crash with us, but Ashley's in the middle of organizing the garage, and honestly, the place is kind of chaotic right now. I stayed at a Holiday Inn Express 3 miles from the house I'd grown up in. Spent Christmas Eve watching television in a room that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner, and someone else's cigarette smoke seeping in from the next unit. My phone buzzed once. A text from Captain Chen. Merry Christmas, Shadow 9. The team's proud of you. I stared at that message for 20 minutes. The team was 11 people scattered across classified locations, doing work that would never make the news when it succeeded, and would be carefully spun if it failed. That was my community. That was who knew me. Something in my chest that had been holding out for a different outcome, for the possibility that family would eventually see what I'd become and adjust their understanding accordingly. That thing went quiet. Not loud, not dramatic, just a small internal light switching off, like the last person leaving a building and hitting the switch out of habit, not even noticing the darkness they're creating because they're already walking away. I didn't cry. I'd learned not to cry years earlier, had trained myself out of that particular vulnerability, the same way I'd trained myself to control heart rate and breathing during stress simulations. But I felt it, the death of expectation, the acceptance that some distances don't close just because you want them to, just because you keep showing up and hoping this time will be different. The years accumulated after that like sediment, like layers that bury old bones until they become fossils. Deployments to places I can't name, operations that succeeded or failed based on information I provided, or analysis I got right, or decisions I made in moments where there was no time to check with anyone more senior. I got good at what I did. Better than good. Exceptional in ways that mattered to the people who knew what to measure. The Navy promoted me ahead of schedule, lieutenant commander at 33, commander at 36. Each promotion came with increased responsibility, increased clearances, increased distance from anything resembling a normal life. I bought a condo in Virginia Beach with cash I'd saved from years of combat pay and hardship bonuses, invested in real estate, 2 rental properties that generated passive income I barely noticed because I was never in one place long enough to spend money anyway. Built a portfolio that grew quietly while I was doing work that didn't grow anything except my own capacity to function in spaces most people couldn't survive. By 2024, I had clearances high enough that I could access information my father had never been read into, even at the height of his career. I had a security clearance called Yankee White, the kind that requires multiple polygraphs and investigations into every friendship and relationship going back to childhood. I had a call sign that meant something in the small, specialized world where I operated. And I had a family who still thought I worked in logistics or intelligence analysis or something vague and bureaucratic that didn't require much skill or generate much importance. The invitation came in November, slipped into my mailbox between a credit card offer and a flyer for pizza delivery. Heavy cream paper, formal letterhead. You are invited to attend a classified briefing and recognition ceremony honoring Lieutenant Commander Derek Mitchell. The event would take place at Naval Station Norfolk. Security protocols outlined. Family members welcome, but subject to clearance verification. My name appeared at the bottom of the guest list. Commander Catherine Mitchell, family guest. No rank designation, no indication of what I did or why I might belong there for reasons beyond blood relation. I held the invitation for 30 minutes, reading it 3 times, feeling the weight of what it represented. Derek was being honored for advisory work he'd done during a deployment to the Persian Gulf. Good work, important work, but standard operational stuff. The kind of thing that gets recognized because it's visible, because it happened in contexts where recognition is possible. Part of me wanted to decline. I'd gotten good at avoiding situations where I'd have to watch my family celebrate achievements while treating mine as either non-existent or incomprehensible. It was easier to just not be there, to save everyone the awkwardness of trying to include me in conversations I couldn't fully participate in. But there was another part, smaller, quieter, stubborn in a way I'd thought I'd trained out of myself, that said this isn't about them seeing you. This is about you standing where you belong, regardless of whether anyone acknowledges it. I thought about Grandmother Mitchell, about her words at my graduation. Don't let them make you invisible. I'd spent 17 years being invisible by design, by choice, because that's what the mission required. But there was a difference between operational invisibility and the kind that came from being dismissed, from being considered too unlikely to bother seeing clearly. I wrote back a single line, "I'll be there." The morning of the briefing was cold for Virginia in November. 43 degrees, wind coming off the water carrying the smell of salt and diesel fuel. I wore my service dress blues, the formal uniform, with all appropriate insignia and ribbons. 4 medals I'd earned in operations my family knew nothing about. The Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with Valor Device, the Joint Service Achievement Medal. 2 others classified enough that I had to get permission to wear them even in secure spaces. Security at the gate was triple the normal level. I handed over my credentials and waited while the guard scanned them. His expression changed when the system returned results. He straightened slightly, met my eyes with something different than the polite professionalism he'd shown the previous visitors. "Good morning, Commander Mitchell. Welcome back." He handed the credentials back with both hands, a small gesture of respect that people outside these spaces might not even notice. I nodded and drove through, following the arrows toward the designated parking area. My father stood near the entrance, talking with Rear Admiral Stevens and Captain Park, 2 men whose names I remembered from childhood dinners and Navy functions that had filled our weekends. When he saw me, he stopped mid-sentence. His eyes went to my uniform, the 4 medals, the warfare insignia, the rank insignia, and then to the badge clipped to my belt. Red, not blue. Operational personnel, not guest. One of the medals he recognized. I saw it register in his face, the Commendation Medal with Valor. He had one from his own service, knew what you had to do to earn it, but mine had an additional device, a gold star indicating combat distinction. His didn't. He didn't speak as I approached. Rear Admiral Stevens turned first, his face breaking into a professional smile that deepened into something more genuine as he processed who I was. "Commander Mitchell, it's good to see you again. We've heard quite a bit about your work from Captain Chen. Excellent performance at the East Africa Station." He extended his hand and I shook it, firm, brief, the standard military greeting between officers of different ranks. My father stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, his certainty fracturing in real time. "You know about Catherine?" The question came out rough, like he'd forgotten how to shape words properly. Admiral Stevens looked at him with mild confusion. Of course, Bob. Your daughter's one of our top performers. She's been doing critical work for years. The word years seemed to hit my father like a physical blow. His eyes went back to my medals, to the badge, to my face, as if seeing it for the first time and trying to reconcile what he was looking at with everything he'd assumed for the past 3 decades. I waited, not because I enjoyed watching him struggle, but because there was nothing I could say that would make this easier. This was his realization to have, his moment of understanding that his map of reality had been missing entire continents. Inside, the briefing room was exactly what I expected. ESCIF configuration, sensitive compartmented information facility, no windows, reinforced walls thick enough to block all signals, 35 chairs arranged in a semicircle facing a podium and screen. Each seat had a thin folder with security markings. Derek sat in the front row with 2 other lieutenant commanders, confident and comfortable. My father took a seat in the third row, the section reserved for retired senior officers and distinguished guests. I sat in the back because that's where operators sit, close to exits, positioned to observe without being observed. Old habits that die hard. Captain James Reeves entered precisely at 0900. He was 52, career surface warfare officer who transitioned into Strategic Operations Command, known for being unflappable, for speaking quietly and expecting people to lean in and listen, rather than raising his voice to command attention. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. You've been invited for 2 purposes. First, to recognize individuals who've served with distinction in recent operations. Second, he paused, let the silence build, to discuss an immediate operational requirement that's developed in the Eastern Mediterranean. The briefing proceeded methodically. Derek was called forward, received his Navy Achievement Medal for advisory work he'd done coordinating communications between coalition forces. My father stood to applaud, pride unmistakable in his face. Derek accepted the medal with a grin, shook hands, returned to his seat. Then Captain Reeves continued. We have a developing situation that requires immediate response. I need an officer with TS, SCI clearance, current Black Operations certification, direct theater experience, and operational status. The room went still. I knew immediately what he was describing. The profile matched exactly the kind of work I'd been doing for the past decade. My body responded before my conscious mind finished processing, muscle memory and training taking over. I stood. My father's laugh cut through the silence like breaking glass. Not mocking, not cruel, but reflexive. The sound of someone so certain of their understanding that contradiction manifests as absurdity. Catherine, sit down. His voice carried across the room. You don't belong here. You don't have the qualifications for that kind of work. Captain Reeves turned to me. He didn't look at my father, didn't acknowledge the interruption except as background noise to be filtered out. His expression remained neutral, professional, waiting for the information that mattered. Call sign, Commander? I held his gaze. Shadow 9. He nodded once, brief, efficient, the acknowledgement of information received and processed. Copy that. Proceed to Briefing Room Alpha after we adjourn. Bring your go bag. Yes, sir. I remained standing, hands behind my back in parade rest, while the room recalibrated around the reality that had just been spoken into existence. Admiral Stevens closed his eyes briefly, exhaled. Captain Park nodded to himself. 4 other senior officers I recognized exchanged glances that communicated understanding without words. Derek had turned completely around in his seat, mouth open, face cycling through confusion and shock, and something that might have been embarrassment or might have been the first stirrings of understanding that he'd been operating with incomplete information for a very long time. My father looked like someone had reached into his chest and stopped his heart manually. Face pale, blood draining away, hands gripping the armrests of his chair hard enough that tendons stood out in sharp relief. His mouth worked, but no sound came. For the first time in my life, I saw Admiral Robert Mitchell completely without words, without the certainty that had defined every interaction I'd ever had with him. I sat back down. The briefing continued. Operational details were discussed in the careful language of people who know how to convey necessary information, without revealing classified specifics. I took notes in the shorthand I developed over years of similar briefings, my hand moving across the page in patterns that would mean nothing to anyone who hadn't been trained to read them. My father didn't move, didn't speak, sat there like a man whose entire understanding of reality had just been revealed as fiction, as a story he'd told himself so many times he'd forgotten it was never checked against actual facts. When Captain Reeves dismissed us, the room emptied in the usual pattern: senior officers first, then mid-grade, then junior personnel. I waited until most people had filed out before standing. Derek caught up with me in the hallway, his face flushed and confused and desperate for answers. "Kate, wait! What the hell was that? Shadow 9? What do you actually do? I thought you worked in intelligence analysis." "You don't need to know, Derek." "Don't need to know, I'm your brother." "And I'm a commander. You just heard Captain Reeves give me orders. I have an operational briefing in 15 minutes. Excuse me." I walked away, leaving him standing in the hallway, and felt no satisfaction in it. Just the weight of years of being unseen, suddenly made visible in a context he couldn't process. Couldn't fit into any of the categories he'd built to organize his understanding of family and capability and worth. My father was waiting around the corner, not blocking my path, but standing in a way that made clear he needed to speak before I left. He looked smaller somehow, like certainty had been providing structural support he'd lost access to. "Shadow 9. He said it carefully, testing the weight of the designation. "How long?" "Long enough." "Why didn't you tell me?" I stopped walking, turned to face him fully. "I did tell you. When I was 18, I want to serve. When I was 22, I've been selected for specialized programs. When I was 25, I'm deploying. When I was 30, I received a designated call sign. Every time you heard what fit your expectations instead of what was actually being said." "I don't understand." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. "You listened for what was comfortable, not for what was true. You heard Derek talk about leadership because that's what you expected. You didn't hear me talk about strategy because that wasn't something you thought I was capable of." Admiral Stevens emerged from a side office, saw us, paused. "Commander Mitchell, they're waiting for you in Alpha." "On my way, sir." I looked at my father one more time. "I have to go to work now. This is where I belong, whether you've been able to see that or not." I walked away, and this time I didn't look back. Behind me, Admiral Robert Mitchell stood in a hallway in a building where he'd once held authority, where people had once deferred to his judgment and confronted the reality that his daughter had surpassed him in ways he'd never imagined to look for. Not because she'd been hiding, but because he'd never thought to ask the right questions. The operational briefing in Room Alpha lasted 90 minutes. Details I can't share. Decisions that affected outcomes I'm not permitted to discuss. Contingency planning for scenarios that existed in the space between what intelligence suggested and what political realities would allow. When it ended, I had 48 hours to prepare for deployment to a location that wouldn't appear on any flight manifest or personnel roster. I drove back to my condo in Virginia Beach as the November afternoon faded into early darkness. The ocean looked gray and restless, waves breaking against the shore with the kind of persistence that wears down stone given enough time. Inside my apartment, everything sat exactly as I'd left it. Minimalist furniture, books on naval strategy arranged by topic rather than author, a single framed photo of Commander Chen from my graduation. No clutter, no decoration that didn't serve a purpose. Living space configured like a ship's quarters, because that's what felt natural after 17 years of making temporary places feel like enough. My phone buzzed as I was packing my go bag. Unknown number, but the area code was San Diego. "Catherine," my mother's voice came through uncertain, like she wasn't sure I'd answer. "Your father wanted me to call. We'd like to talk to you before you leave again." The deployment timeline meant I had 36 hours before I needed to be wheels up. Enough time if I pushed it, if I was willing to turn around and drive back to Norfolk or find a flight that worked with operational security requirements. "I have a very limited window, Mom. We understand." Her voice carried something fragile in it, something I couldn't quite identify because we'd never had the kind of relationship where emotional nuance got discussed directly. "There's a luncheon this weekend, a recognition event. Derek will be there, but it's smaller than the briefing. Your father thought he'd like you to come, if you can." The careful phrasing told me everything. My father had asked her to make this call because he didn't know how to make it himself, didn't have language for what he needed to say or ask or repair. "Send me the details, I'll see what I can do." After she hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed holding the phone, trying to decide if this was worth reorganizing my pre-deployment checklist around. Part of me, the part that had learned to insulate against disappointment, said it would be more of the same. Another event where my presence was tolerated, but not understood, where I'd watch my family celebrate Derek while treating my own service as background noise. But there was a new variable now. They knew. Not everything. They'd never know everything, but enough that the foundation of their assumptions had fractured. What came next would determine whether that fracture could become an opening or just another form of distance. I pulled up my laptop and started rearranging logistics. The recognition luncheon took place at a Hilton conference room overlooking the Norfolk waterfront. More intimate than the formal briefing, maybe 40 people instead of the larger crowd. A mix of active duty personnel and civilian leadership involved in naval operations. The dress code was business formal rather than uniforms, which meant I wore slacks and a blazer instead of service dress. My father and mother arrived together. He looked older than he had 3 days earlier, like the intervening 72 hours had compressed a year's worth of aging into long nights and difficult realizations. My mother wore pearls and a navy dress, her hair styled the way she'd worn it for every formal military event I could remember. When she saw me, relief flooded her expression so obviously that it hurt to witness. "Catherine, honey, you came." She hugged me with the kind of force that suggested she hadn't been certain I would, that my absence had become expected enough that my presence registered as surprise. My father stood behind her, hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched, the posture of a man who'd spent his career standing at attention and now couldn't quite figure out where his body belonged in space. "Dad." "Catherine." He cleared his throat. "Thank you for making time." The formality felt like scar tissue over something raw neither of us knew how to touch directly. We moved into the conference room and took seats at a round table near the center. Derek and Ashley were already there, their 2 kids deposited with Ashley's mother for the afternoon. Derek looked uncomfortable in the way people do when social scripts they've always relied on suddenly don't apply. The program started with coffee service and networking time. People circulated, conversations humming at the professional volume that exists between silence and actual noise. Several officers I'd worked with on previous operations nodded as they passed, acknowledgement that couldn't be more overt without violating operational security. Each small recognition landed differently now that my family was watching, now that they could see the shape of something they hadn't known existed. A civilian official from the Department of Defense gave the keynote address. He was in his 60s, gray-haired and careful in his diction. Someone who'd spent decades learning how to talk about sensitive topics in rooms where some people had full context and others only had fragments. "We gather to honor those who serve in ways the public will never see, who make decisions that carry enormous weight without expectation of recognition, who bear responsibility alone, because that's what the mission requires." Several heads turned subtly in my direction before turning away again. My father noticed. I saw the micro-movements in his face, the tightening around his eyes, the barely perceptible nod as he processed what those glances meant. Ashley leaned over to whisper something to Derek. He shook his head slightly, kept his eyes forward. Whatever was happening between them would have to wait until later. After the speeches concluded and lunch service began, people started circulating again. Admiral Stevens stopped by our table, coffee cup in hand. "Bob, good to see you. And Helen, you're looking well." He acknowledged my parents with the easy warmth of old friendship before turning to me. "Commander Mitchell, I heard your wheel's up soon. Safe travels." "Thank you, sir." He moved on, but the interaction left residue. My mother's confusion was visible in the small furrow between her eyebrows, in the way her hands fidgeted with her napkin. Derek stared at his plate like it might contain answers to questions he didn't know how to formulate. My father stood abruptly. "Catherine, can we talk?" "Outside?" The hallway was quieter, decorated with framed photographs of naval vessels spanning decades of technological evolution. Carriers and destroyers and submarines, each one representing thousands of person-hours and strategic calculations and the physical manifestation of national will projected across oceans. "I didn't know." He said it flatly, without defensiveness, just stating fact. All these years, I genuinely didn't know. I waited. This was his realization to articulate, his understanding to build from components he was just now learning to see. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question came out raw, confused rather than accusatory. I did. When I was 18, 22, 25, 30. Every major milestone I tried to share. But you heard what fit your template of who I was allowed to be, not what I was actually saying. He flinched at that, a visible recoil like the words were physical impact. I don't understand. I thought I was listening. You listened for what was comfortable. When Derek talked about leadership, you heard potential because that matched your expectation. When I talked about strategic analysis, you filtered it through your assumption that I was support staff, background personnel. You weren't listening to update your understanding. You were listening to confirm what you'd already decided was true. The distinction landed with weight I could see accumulating in his posture. He turned to one of the framed photographs, a destroyer from his era of service, the kind of ship he'd served on during his own active duty. I thought I knew you. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. I built my entire understanding of my daughter on assumptions I never questioned. And now I'm standing here realizing that the person I thought I knew is not fiction exactly, but incomplete. A shadow of who you actually are. Not a shadow. I kept my tone gentle because there was no satisfaction in cruelty, no value in making this harder than it already was. Just a version of me that made sense to you. The version that didn't challenge your worldview or require you to reconsider what your daughter specifically, was capable of. He nodded slowly, processing. When you stood up in that briefing room, when you said your call sign, I felt something break. Not pride, not fear, my certainty. The foundation I built my life on, knowing where things stood, understanding the order of things. That shattered. I watched him wrestle with it. This man who'd organized his entire existence around clarity and structure, now confronting ambiguity he'd created through his own selective perception. What hurt the most wasn't that I was wrong about your capabilities. It's that I was so sure I was right that I never thought to verify. Never asked the questions that would have revealed how wrong I was. The admission cost him something visible. His shoulders curved inward slightly, the military bearing that had always defined him softening into something more human and more vulnerable. We stood there for a long moment, surrounded by images of ships that had been decommissioned or sunk or turned into museums. Physical reminders that everything eventually becomes obsolete if it doesn't adapt. I need to ask you something. His voice steadied as he found the question. Is there a way to fix this? Or have I damaged it beyond repair? That depends. I met his eyes directly. Are you asking because you want to maintain the relationship we had? Or because you're willing to build one based on who I actually am, rather than who you thought I should be? The second one. He didn't hesitate. Definitely the second one. Then it's not broken beyond repair, but it's going to require you to be uncomfortable, to ask questions without knowing the answers, to accept that there are things about my work you'll never be cleared to know, and that your daughter has been operating at levels you didn't reach during your own service. The last part landed hard. I saw it in the way his jaw tightened, the instinctive defensiveness of a man confronting the reality that his child had exceeded him. But he didn't argue, didn't deflect, just absorbed it like medicine that tastes terrible but treats the disease. I can do that. I want to do that. We'll see. I softened it with a slight smile. Words are easy, actions take longer. Inside, lunch was winding down. Ashley had cornered Derek near the dessert table, their conversation intense but quiet, her body language insistent while his registered something between defense and dawning comprehension. My mother sat alone at our table, shredding a napkin into small, precise strips, a nervous habit I remembered from childhood when she was processing emotions she didn't know how to express. When we returned, she looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "Catherine, I'm sorry." The words tumbled out before my father and I had fully sat down. "I didn't understand. I thought you were just—" I made assumptions about what your life was and I was wrong and I'm so sorry. The apology was sincere but incomplete, addressing symptoms without examining causes. Before I could respond, Derek approached with Ashley slightly behind him, her hand on his shoulder in a gesture that read as equal parts support and pressure. "Kate, I need to say something." Derek's voice was thick with something. Embarrassment, maybe, or the beginning of genuine understanding. "I've been an asshole. Not maliciously, but through ignorance, which might actually be worse. I spent our entire lives assuming I was the successful one, the one Dad was proud of, the one doing important work. And I never questioned why you were so quiet about your service. I assumed it was because there wasn't much to talk about. The honesty was uncomfortable for everyone. Ashley's expression suggested she'd been pushing for this conversation, that Derek's self-awareness hadn't arrived independently. "I've been thinking about Sophia," he continued, and the shift in topic seemed abrupt until I understood where he was going. "She's 10 now, smart as hell, quiet like you were. And I realized yesterday that I've been doing to her what Dad did to you, praising Lucas for being loud and athletic and confident, treating Sophia's thoughtfulness like it's shyness, like it's something she needs to grow out of rather than a legitimate way of being." Ashley's eyes were wet. "We don't want to repeat the pattern. We want to do better." The generational awareness hit differently than individual apologies. This wasn't just about repairing relationships in the present, but about preventing damage from cascading forward, about recognizing patterns early enough to intervene. "Sophia needs to see women who are quiet and capable," Derek continued. "Women who don't have to be loud to be effective. I thought maybe, if you're willing, you could spend time with her, let her see what strength looks like in different forms." My mother made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. I looked at her across the table and saw her understanding crystallizing, the recognition that she'd done the same thing, maybe for different reasons, but with similar impact. Treated my quietness as deficiency rather than difference, my independence as distance rather than strength. "Mom," I kept my voice level, giving her space to choose whether to speak into this moment or let it pass. She wiped her eyes with the shredded napkin, took a breath that shook slightly. "I had a sister, Margaret. Your father mentioned it might help if I told you about her." This was new territory. I'd never heard about any aunt, any sibling my mother had lost or been estranged from. She was brilliant, wanted to be a doctor when women weren't encouraged in medicine. Our family pushed her toward nursing instead, practical, appropriate, safe. She refused. She left for medical school and we pulled away. Made it clear we thought she was making a mistake, that she was too ambitious, too stubborn, too unwilling to accept her proper role. My mother's hands twisted the napkin remnants into tight spirals. She died in a car accident when she was 28. Alone? Because she'd estranged herself from family who wouldn't support her choices. And I've carried that guilt ever since. The belief that if she'd just been more reasonable, less insistent on proving herself, she'd still be alive. The connection clicked into place with terrible clarity. When you were born, when you started showing that same independence, that same quiet determination, I was terrified. Terrified that supporting you would push you away from family safety, that you'd end up like Margaret, successful maybe, but alone and vulnerable. "So you pushed me away first." My voice was soft, but the words were sharp, cutting through to the mechanism underneath the fear. "You thought if I wasn't too close, if I learned to be independent early, then when I left it wouldn't hurt as much. And if something happened to me, you'd have protected yourself from that pain." Yes, she said it like a confession, like admitting to a crime that had seemed justified in the moment, but looked monstrous in retrospect. My father reached across and took her hand. "We both failed you, for different reasons, from different places, but we both chose our own comfort over your need to be seen and supported." The acknowledgement hung there, heavy with implications about what came next. Apologies were starting points, not destinations. The real work would be in whether they could sustain this new awareness through the mundane difficulties of actually changing behavior, of catching themselves mid-assumption, and choosing different responses. "I'm deploying tomorrow." The practicality helped ground the conversation before it dissolved into sentiment that couldn't be sustained without action. "I'll be gone for approximately 4 months. I can't tell you where. Can't give you contact information beyond an emergency email that routes through several secure servers." My father nodded, military training helping him understand what I could and couldn't share, even if the specifics remained classified. "When I get back, if you're serious about rebuilding this, I'll make time. But I need you to understand that I'm not going to explain myself repeatedly, not going to keep offering information only to have it dismissed or minimized. If you want to know me, you have to actually listen. Not listen to respond, not listen to confirm what you think you know, but listen to learn. We can do that. My mother's voice was firm despite the tears still tracking down her face. We will do that. Derek cleared his throat. And when you're back, we'd like you to spend time with Sophia and Lucas. Let them know their aunt, the real version, not the vague relative who shows up occasionally and then disappears. Ashley added her own weight to the commitment. I know we can't understand everything about your work, but we can understand that it matters, that you matter, and that we've been failing to see that for too long. The afternoon ended with something that wasn't quite reconciliation, but wasn't the old distance either. A space opened up between us, fragile, tentative, dependent on sustained effort to remain accessible. My father walked me to my car, moving slowly like he was learning a new gait after years of automatic motion. At my vehicle, he stopped. I'm proud of you, Catherine. The words came out rough, unpracticed. I've always been proud, I didn't know how to say it. Didn't think I needed to because I assumed you knew. I didn't know. That's the problem with assumptions. They feel like communication when they were actually just internal monologue. He absorbed that, nodded. I'll do better. Not because you're demanding it, but because you deserve better than what I gave you. I got in my car and watched him in the rearview mirror as I drove away. A man standing in a parking lot, looking smaller and more uncertain than I'd ever seen him, finally beginning to grasp the magnitude of what he'd missed by refusing to look clearly at what was right in front of him. The deployment went as planned. I can't detail it, can't describe the geography or the specific operations or the outcomes that resulted from decisions made in rooms where my input carried weight. What I can say is that it was 4 months of work that mattered, that made tangible differences in scenarios where failure meant consequences measured in lives rather than abstractions. I thought about my family intermittently during downtime, during the spaces between operations when exhaustion didn't immediately pull me toward sleep. Wondered if the awareness they'd reached in that conference room hallway would sustain itself through months of absence, through the normal erosion that happens when good intentions meet the friction of daily life and established patterns. Emails came through the secure server sporadically. My mother wrote brief updates about Sophia's school projects, about Lucas making the travel soccer team, about my father attending a talk at the Naval War College, about modern strategic doctrine. Surface-level information, but written with an attention to detail that suggested she was trying to stay connected even without knowing how to ask meaningful questions about my work. Derek sent photos of the kids, short notes about their activities, no assumptions about what I was doing, no casual dismissals. The absence of his usual patterns was noticeable, like negative space in a drawing that reveals shape through what's not there. My father wrote once a month exactly. Formal in tone, but attempting something more personal in content, telling me about conversations he'd had with other retired officers, about gradually understanding how much of modern naval operations had evolved beyond his experience, about accepting that his daughter operated in realms he'd never accessed even at the peak of his career. The emails were imperfect, sometimes awkward, but they represented effort. That counted for something. When I returned stateside in March, I gave myself 48 hours to decompress before contacting anyone. Old habit, necessary practice. Coming back from deep operations requires time to shed the particular vigilance they demand, to recalibrate to environments where every interaction isn't potentially compromised, and every decision doesn't cascade into life or death consequences. On the third day, I called my mother. Her voice when she answered carried genuine warmth, genuine relief, rather than the polite distance that had characterized our previous interactions. Catherine, you're back. Are you safe? Are you well? The questions were simple, but represented a shift. Asking about my well-being as a person, rather than just checking a box on family obligation. I'm back. I'm good. I have 2 weeks before my next assignment. I thought I might drive down if you and Dad are available. The pause before she answered told me she was checking with him, probably covering the phone and having a quick exchange. Yes. Please come. We'd love to see you. And Catherine, Sophia's been asking about you. She's been reading about oceanography. Says she wants to join the Navy when she's older. That stopped me. 10 years old and already thinking about service, already orienting toward paths that would put her in the small percentage of women who chose military careers. Does Derek know? He does now. She's been pretty insistent. Ashley's supportive, but Derek is. He's processing, trying to understand if this is real interest or just childhood fantasy. But I think regardless, he wants you to talk with her, to let her see what that path actually looks like. I'll be there this weekend. The drive down to San Diego felt different this time. Usually these trips carried weight of obligation, of steeling myself for interactions that would drain more than they nourished. This time the weight was anticipation tinged with wariness, hope that the changes were real, fear that they'd prove superficial once we were back in established patterns and old roles. My parents' house looked the same from the outside. Same beige stucco, same trimmed lawn, same American flag by the front door that my father raised every morning and lowered every evening, with the kind of ritualistic precision that had organized his entire life. My mother opened the door before I'd finished walking up the path. She hugged me hard, holding on longer than usual. And when she pulled back, her eyes were searching my face like she was looking for something she'd missed before. You look tired, but good, strong. Deployments are exhausting. I kept it simple, offering what I could without detail that would concern her or violate operational security. My father appeared behind her, and the change in him was immediately visible. Not physically. He looked the same, maybe slightly more gray at the temples, but his bearing was different. Less rigid, more open, like he'd released some tension he'd been carrying for decades without realizing it. Catherine, welcome home. The word home landed softly but deliberately. He meant it as more than just the physical house, meant it as claiming me back into family space in a way he'd failed to do before. Thanks, Dad. It's good to see you both. Inside, the house smelled like my mother's cooking, roast chicken and vegetables, the meal she made for special occasions when she wanted to convey care through food because verbal expression remained difficult. Derek's family was expected in an hour, giving us time to talk before the gathering became more complex. We sat in the living room. My father had clearly prepared for this conversation because he pulled out a notebook, the kind he'd used during his active duty for logging important information he needed to track and reference. I've been reading. He opened it to show pages of notes in his precise handwriting. Articles about women in special operations, about the evolution of naval intelligence, about clearance levels and operational classifications. I can't know specifics about what you do, but I wanted to understand the framework, the context, the effort that represented a man in his 70s teaching himself new information, updating his understanding, doing the homework necessary to have informed conversations, was more meaningful than any spoken apology. This is good, Dad. I scanned the notes, saw places where he'd written questions in margins, where he'd cross-referenced different sources. You've done real research. I needed to. Because I realized I'd been operating on assumptions from my own service era, and the Navy you serve in is fundamentally different. Not worse or better, but different. And I was judging you by standards that didn't apply. My mother leaned forward. I've been doing something similar, reading about women in male-dominated fields, about how family support or lack of it impacts career development, about how our own fears and traumas get transmitted to our children, even when we're trying to protect them. She'd been seeing a therapist, she explained, working through the guilt about Margaret, about the ways that unprocessed grief had shaped her parenting, about learning to separate my safety from my independence. I'm learning that I confused closeness with control, that my way of loving you was actually a way of keeping you at arm's length so I wouldn't be hurt if something happened. But what I didn't understand was that you were hurting all along, and I was the one causing it. The admission was raw, harder for her than for my father because she'd built her identity around being the nurturing parent, the one who made emotional connections while he provided structure. Confronting her failures in that role required dismantling a core piece of how she understood herself. Before I could respond, the doorbell rang. Derek and Ashley with both kids, Sophia carrying a thick book about submarine technology that was clearly above her grade level, but that she was determinedly working through anyway. She looked up at me with eyes that were eerily similar to my own. Dark, observant, taking in everything while giving away little. The kind of eyes that learned early to watch before speaking, to understand before committing. Hi, Aunt Kate. Her voice was quiet but clear, not shy so much as careful. Hi, Sophia. That's a pretty advanced book you've got there. She clutched it tighter. I'm learning about acoustic signature management, how submarines stay quiet so they can't be detected. It's really interesting once you understand the physics. Derek and Ashley exchanged glances. This was clearly a pattern that had been developing. This deep dive into technical material that most 10-year-olds wouldn't approach voluntarily. Sophia, why don't you show Aunt Kate your project? Ashley's prompting was gentle, giving her daughter permission to share something she'd been working on. We moved to the dining room table where Sophia had spread out a poster board covered in diagrams and notes, a research project on naval communication systems that would have impressed middle school science teachers, but was coming from a fifth grader. I created a model showing how different communication methods work underwater versus on the surface. Radio doesn't propagate through water efficiently, but extremely low-frequency signals can penetrate pretty deep if you have enough power. And then there's acoustic communication, which is slower but more reliable in ocean environments. She explained her research with precision, stumbling occasionally on terminology, but clearly understanding the concepts she was describing. I recognized myself at that age. The hunger for technical knowledge, the fascination with systems and how they worked, the joy of understanding something complex and seeing all the pieces fit together. This is exceptional work, Sophia. Have you thought about what you want to do with this interest? She looked at her parents, then back at me. I want to join the Navy, maybe submarines or communications. Dad says I have to wait until I'm older to decide, but I don't think I'll change my mind. Derek shifted uncomfortably. We're not saying she can't. We just want her to understand what it actually involves. The commitment, the training, the sacrifices. That's good. I directed this to Derek, but spoke for Sophia's benefit too. Any career worth pursuing requires sacrifice. The question is whether the sacrifice serves something you value enough to justify it. Sophia nodded seriously, absorbing this. Lucas, meanwhile, had abandoned the conversation to play on a tablet in the corner, completely disinterested in the technical discussion. At 8, he embodied everything Derek had been at that age. Energetic, social, more interested in immediate experience than abstract understanding. Neither approach was wrong, but they required different kinds of support and recognition. Ashley pulled me aside while Sophia was showing my mother her project. Thank you for taking her seriously. Most adults humor her but don't really engage with the technical content. She notices the difference. She reminds me of myself at that age. I kept my voice low so Sophia wouldn't hear, but would carry back to Derek. The worst thing you can do is treat that curiosity like it's a phase she'll outgrow. It's not, it's who she is. We're trying. Ashley's expression was earnest, almost desperate for guidance. Derek's been different since that briefing in November. More aware of his own biases, more intentional about how he talks to both kids. But old patterns are hard to break. The fact that you're trying matters. I thought about Commander Chen, about the mentor who'd seen me clearly enough to guide me toward work that matched my capabilities. Sophia needs to see examples of women who do technical, demanding work, not just hear about them abstractly, but actually interact with them. If you're comfortable with it, I can introduce her to some colleagues who work in naval engineering and communications. Really? Ashley's face lit up with relief that felt disproportionate until I understood what it represented. The validation that she wasn't crazy to take her daughter's interests seriously, that other people saw value in supporting Sophia's particular path. Really. And if she's still interested in a few years, there are summer programs at the Naval Academy for high school students. Let her see what that environment is actually like before she commits. Derek appeared at Ashley's shoulder. I heard that. Thank you for seeing her and for giving us tools to support her better. The afternoon evolved into dinner, conversation ranging across topics with a different quality than previous family gatherings. People asked questions that indicated actual curiosity rather than obligation. They listened to answers without immediately pivoting to different subjects. When Derek talked about his work, it was contextualized within broader conversation rather than dominating it. When I mentioned aspects of my service I could discuss, people leaned in rather than glazing over. The difference was subtle but pervasive, like the air pressure had changed and everyone was breathing a little easier. After dinner, my father asked if I'd walk with him. The neighborhood was quiet in the way the San Diego suburbs get in early evening, lights coming on in windows, families settling into routines, the last warmth of the day fading into cool that would require jackets in another hour. I've been thinking about what strength means. He started without preamble, hands in his pockets, eyes forward. I spent my career believing strength was volume, presence, commanding attention, the ability to dominate a room. We walked in silence for half a block before he continued. But watching you in that briefing room, watching how you stood and spoke with complete certainty, but without needing to raise your voice or prove anything, I realized I'd been wrong about what strength looks like. Or not wrong exactly, but incomplete. I only recognized one flavor of it. He stopped at a corner where a street light was just flickering on, casting orange light that made everything look slightly unreal. Your strength was always there. I just didn't have the framework to see it. Silence wasn't absence. It was choice. Quiet wasn't weakness. It was conservation of energy for what mattered. But I'd built my entire identity around a different model, and I couldn't see past my own template. I watched a neighbor watering plants in their front yard, ordinary life continuing around this conversation that felt like crossing a threshold. The hardest part isn't admitting I was wrong. It's understanding how many years I wasted being wrong, how much damage I did by refusing to question my assumptions. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. I put my hand on his shoulder, a gesture that felt awkward because we'd never been physically demonstrative, but necessary because some moments require touch to convey what words can't. We can't get those years back, Dad, but we can choose what happens with the years ahead. He nodded, composing himself. I want to do better, not just with you, but with Sophia, with any young woman who crosses my path thinking about service. I want to be the kind of person who sees them clearly instead of filtering them through outdated expectations. Then do that. I kept it simple because complicated wouldn't serve either of us. Start now and keep going. We turned back toward the house where lights glowed warm through windows, where my family was learning, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely, how to make space for all the kinds of strength that existed, rather than just the ones they'd been trained to recognize. 3 days later, I had to report for my next assignment. The goodbye was different this time. My mother hugged me with arms that felt less desperate, less like she was trying to hold on to something she feared losing, and more like she was releasing me with confidence I'd return. Be safe. Come back when you can. We'll be here. My father shook my hand formally, then pulled me into a brief hug that was stiff but sincere. Proud of you, Commander. Do good work. Sophia gave me her copy of the submarine technology book. For your deployment, so you have something interesting to read. I can't take this, Sophia. This is yours. She shook her head stubbornly. I have another one on order. And besides, you should have it. For good luck. I took the book, heavy with more than just information, and promised to bring it back. The drive back to Virginia felt lighter somehow. Like I'd set down weight I'd been carrying so long, I'd forgotten it was optional. The road ahead still stretched uncertain, still full of challenges and dangers I couldn't predict. But behind me, finally, was something that felt like foundation rather than void, like ground that might hold if I needed to step back onto it. The assignment lasted 6 months instead of the projected 4. Operations in that particular theater expanded based on intelligence developments I can't detail, cascading into scenarios that required sustained presence rather than quick intervention. By the time I rotated back stateside, it was late September, autumn settling into the mid-Atlantic with that particular quality of light that makes everything look softer, more forgiving. I gave myself the standard decompression period before contacting family. 3 days alone in my Virginia Beach condo, running on the beach at dawn, sitting on my small balcony watching container ships pass on the horizon, letting the particular vigilance of deployment gradually release its grip on my nervous system. The transition never got easier. Coming back from places where every decision carried weight measured in consequences you couldn't undo. Returning to environments where the stakes felt simultaneously trivial and overwhelming in different ways. On the 4th day, I called my mother. She answered on the 2nd ring, her voice carrying relief that had become familiar in the months since our conversation in March. Catherine, you're back. When did you get in? Few days ago. I needed some time to adjust before being around people. Of course, honey. Of course. There was no hurt in her acceptance, no guilt trip about prioritizing my own needs over immediate family contact. That itself represented growth. Are you well? Can you come visit? I'm planning to drive down next weekend if that works. Perfect. We're having a family dinner Saturday. Nothing formal, just all of us together. Sophia's been asking about you constantly. How's she doing? My mother's laugh came warm through the phone. She's relentless. Started a robotics club at school when she found out they didn't have one. Recruited 5 other kids, found a teacher advisor, submitted a proposal to the principal. At 10 years old. That sounds exactly right. I found myself smiling despite the exhaustion still clinging to my edges. Derek doesn't know what to do with her half the time. She's so much like you were. Determined, focused, doesn't ask permission so much as inform people what's happening. But he's trying. They both are. After we hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand, processing the shift. 6 months ago, my mother wouldn't have drawn the comparison between Sophia and me with such ease, wouldn't have treated my particular brand of determination as something worth replicating rather than something to be concerned about or corrected. The drive to San Diego happened on a Saturday in early October. Traffic was manageable, weather perfect, that California sunshine that makes everything look like it belongs in a postcard. I'd bought gifts for the kids during a brief stopover in Germany between assignments, small things that wouldn't violate any security protocols, but that represented thought and attention. Derek's house was in a suburb 20 minutes from where we'd grown up. A neighborhood of similar homes with similar yards where kids played soccer in the streets, and parents waved from driveways while washing cars. The kind of place that represented stability, routine, the accumulation of ordinary life into something substantial. Sophia answered the door before I'd finished walking up the path. She'd grown in 6 months, taller, leaner, hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that made her look older than 10. The submarine book I'd returned by mail was visible on the entry table, placed there deliberately, I suspected, so I'd see it immediately. "Aunt Kate, you came!" Said I would. I handed her a wrapped package. "This is for you." She tore into it with the kind of focused efficiency that reminded me of myself opening operational orders. No wasted motion, direct path to the objective. Inside was a compass, military grade but small enough to fit in a pocket. The same kind Commander Chen had given me 15 years earlier, though I didn't explain that connection. "It's beautiful." Sophia turned it over in her hands, watching the needle settle to north. "Why a compass?" "So you always know where you're pointing. Even when everything around you is confusing or chaotic, you can check your bearing and stay oriented." She looked up at me with understanding beyond her years, like knowing who you are even when other people don't understand. Exactly like that. Lucas was less interested in the gift I brought him, a puzzle globe that showed shipping routes and naval bases, but accepted it with 8-year-old politeness before returning to a video game in the living room. Different kids, different needs, both valid in their own contexts. Ashley hugged me with genuine warmth. "Thank you for making time for this. I know your schedule is impossible. Family matters, even when it's complicated. Especially when it's complicated." She led me to the kitchen where Derek was managing multiple pots on the stove, attempting some kind of elaborate pasta dish that seemed beyond his usual capabilities. "I'm trying to expand my cooking repertoire. Ashley's been doing most of it for years. Figured it was time I contributed more than just grilling." The domestic scene felt surreal in the way that returning home after deployment always did. People concerned with sauce consistency and whether the pasta was al dente while I was still mentally cataloging exit routes and potential threats. Still operating with threat assessment protocols that made no sense in suburban California, but took time to fully deactivate. "How was it?" Derek asked, carefully vague in a way that suggested he'd been coached about what he could and couldn't ask. "Productive. Exhausting. I can't give you details, but the work mattered." He nodded, accepting the boundaries without pushing against them. "That's what's important." We ate on the back patio, late afternoon sun slanting across the yard, where a trampoline and soccer goal suggested the kind of childhood I hadn't experienced, one organized around play and friends and the luxury of boredom. Sophia picked at her food, more interested in asking questions than eating. "Did you always want to join the Navy?" "No." I considered lying, offering a simplified narrative that would be easier to digest, but decided honesty served better. I wanted to be seen as capable. The Navy became the path where I could prove that in ways that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. "But people still dismissed you." Sophia's observation was sharp, direct. "Grandpa and Grandma didn't understand what you did." "Not until very recently." I met her eyes across the table. "Sometimes the people who love us struggle to see us clearly. Not because they don't care, but because they're looking through filters built from their own experiences and expectations." Derek set his fork down carefully. "I need to say something, Sophia. I did that too. dismissed Aunt Kate's work because I didn't understand it, didn't ask questions that would have revealed what I was missing. That was wrong. And I'm sorry, Kate. I know I've said it before, but I need to keep saying it until the apology feels proportional to the harm. The vulnerability in his voice was genuine, uncomfortable in the way real acknowledgement of failure tends to be. Ashley reached over and squeezed his hand, silent support for the difficulty of sustained accountability. Lucas looked up from his pasta, confused by the serious tone. Did something bad happen? Not bad exactly. Ashley chose her words carefully. But sometimes we hurt people without meaning to because we don't understand their experience. Your aunt spent a long time being treated like what she did wasn't important. We're working on doing better. Lucas processed this with 8-year-old logic. But Aunt Kate's really important. She has medals and everything. The simplicity of childhood perspective, seeing what was visible without all the complicating layers of assumption and bias that adults accumulated. Out of the mouths of children came clarity adults spent decades learning to see. After dinner, Sophia asked if I'd look at her robotics club project. We went to her room, which was organized with the kind of precision I recognized. Books arranged by subject, desk clear except for current projects, a bulletin board covered in diagrams and technical specifications that would have looked at home in an engineering lab. We're building an underwater drone. She pulled up schematics on her laptop. Designs that were ambitious but fundamentally sound. It has to navigate autonomously using sonar mapping and can collect water samples at different depths. This is sophisticated work for a middle school club. We have a mentor. One of the engineers from the Navy base volunteers his time. He says I remind him of his daughter who's in college studying mechanical engineering now. The chain of mentorship extending forward. Each generation lifting the next in ways that became possible once someone first extended the reach. I thought about Commander Chen, about what her recognition had meant for my trajectory, about the responsibility to do the same for others. Have you thought about what comes after middle school? High school programs, summer opportunities? Sophia nodded seriously. Mom and I looked at the Naval Academy Summer STEM program. But it's competitive. They only take 40 students nationwide. Apply anyway. Worst case, they say no, and you've lost nothing but the time it took to fill out the application. Best case, you get exposure to the environment and start building connections early. Her face lit with possibility. You really think I could get in? I think you're exactly the kind of person they're looking for. Curious, driven, not waiting for permission to pursue what interests you. Those are the qualities that matter more than grades or test scores, though you'll need those too. We talked for another hour about technical details of her drone project, about the physics of underwater navigation, about the difference between theoretical understanding and practical implementation. Sophia absorbed everything with the kind of focused attention that made teaching her feel like pouring water into good soil. Nothing wasted, everything used for growth. When I came back downstairs, my parents had arrived. My father looked older than he had in March, the months since our last conversation adding weight that showed in the deeper lines around his eyes, the slower way he moved from the car to the house. But his bearing remained military straight, the ingrained posture that decades of service had made permanent. Catherine. He embraced me briefly, the physical contact still awkward but increasingly natural. Good to see you home safely. My mother's hug lasted longer, her hands on my shoulders when she pulled back to study my face. You look tired, honey, but strong, always so strong. The observation carried weight it wouldn't have had a year ago. Recognition rather than concern. Acknowledgement rather than worry masquerading as care. We settled in the living room, conversation flowing across topics with the ease that came from practice. My father had attended a symposium at the Naval War College, he explained, about asymmetric warfare and the evolution of maritime strategy in an era of great power competition. I kept thinking about what you must be doing. Obviously, I don't know specifics, can't know specifics. But understanding the framework helps me appreciate the complexity even without details. He'd brought a book, a recent publication about intelligence operations in the 21st century, heavily redacted but publicly available. Had marked passages with careful notes and margins, questions he'd written to himself about how doctrine translated to practice. I thought you might find this interesting. Or maybe you already know everything in it and I'm being presumptuous. I flipped through the marked pages, saw thoughtful engagement with material that challenged his earlier assumptions. This is good, Dad. Shows real effort to understand context different from your own experience. My mother had been working with a therapist, she shared, processing not just the guilt about Margaret, but broader patterns about how she'd learned to love from her own parents, how those patterns had shaped her parenting in ways she'd never examined until forced to. I'm learning that protection and control got tangled together, that I thought keeping you at distance would hurt less if something happened. But what I didn't see was that the distance itself was the hurt. You were right there, and I was making you invisible because I was scared. The work of genuine change showing itself not in grand gestures, but in this kind of vulnerable articulation, in the willingness to name mechanisms she'd operated by without conscious awareness. Derek brought out photo albums later, spreading them across the coffee table. Pictures from childhood, from holidays, from graduations and deployments. Visual record of a family history that looked cohesive in still images, but that I remembered differently in lived experience. He stopped at one photo, my Annapolis graduation, the public ceremony. I stood in the back row of our family group shot, slightly apart, not fully integrated into the arrangement. I look at this now and see what I missed then. You're there, but not quite there. Like even in family photos, you'd learn to make yourself smaller, less present. Ashley leaned over his shoulder. And no one thought to rearrange, to bring you forward, to make sure you were centered too. The observation hung there, evidence of pattern rather than isolated incident. My father cleared his throat, discomfort visible in the way he shifted his weight. There are a lot of photos like that. Years of them. Visual record of how we failed to see you clearly, failed to make space for you to be fully present. He pulled out another album, this one I hadn't seen before. Recent photos from the past 6 months. Sophia at her robotics club, holding a trophy for a regional competition they'd won. Lucas at soccer practice, mid-kick, face scrunched with concentration. But interspersed were photos that surprised me. Derek had printed pictures from my Navy file, professional photos that were public record, images of me receiving commendations, standing with my unit in poses that revealed nothing classified but showed me in context of my actual work. He'd created a family album that included my service as fully present rather than vaguely acknowledged. I wanted Sophia and Lucas to see you completely. Not just the aunt who visits occasionally, but Commander Mitchell who does work that matters even though we can't know all the details. The gesture landed hard. Unexpected weight of someone taking concrete action to repair what words alone couldn't fix. Ashley wiped her eyes, trying to be subtle about it but failing. This means something. My voice came out rougher than intended. You didn't have to do this. Yes, we did. Derek's certainty was absolute. We absolutely did. Because words are easy and action takes effort, and you deserved effort years ago. The evening stretched into night, conversation eventually fragmenting into smaller groups. My mother and Ashley in the kitchen preparing dessert. Lucas on the floor with the puzzle globe. Derek helping him identify different naval bases. My father and I on the patio, watching the sky darken from blue to purple to black. I've been asked to speak. He started without looking at me, eyes on the emerging stars, at a veterans gathering in December, about leadership and mentorship and what we get wrong when we're so certain we're right. That's good, you should do it. I want to talk about you, with your permission, not specifics, nothing that would compromise operational security, but about how I failed to see my own daughter. How certainty became blindness, how assumptions prevented understanding. His voice carried weight of someone who'd spent months thinking about this, preparing for a conversation that scared him but that he knew needed to happen. I want to tell them that our children aren't extensions of us, that they're complete people with capabilities we might not recognize if we're only looking for reflections of ourselves. He turned to face me finally, moonlight catching the silver in his hair. But I need your permission to use your story. Even in vague terms, even without identifying details, it's your life and your choice whether it becomes teaching material for others. The request itself demonstrated growth, asking rather than assuming, seeking consent rather than taking for granted that my experience existed for his use. I thought about Commander Chen, about the way good mentorship rippled forward through time. Each person reached becoming capable of reaching others. You can tell it. If it helps even one father see their daughter more clearly, Or one officer recognized capability they're filtering out through bias. Then something useful comes from the years of being unseen. Thank you, he said it simply, without elaborate gratitude that would have felt performative. This matters more than you might realize. We sat in silence for a while, comfortable quiet rather than the strained absence of things that needed saying but couldn't be voiced. Sophia appeared in the doorway, backlit by interior lights. Aunt Kate, can I ask you something? Always. She came out onto the patio, sat cross-legged on the concrete with the kind of flexibility only children possess. Do you ever get scared doing what you do? The question was more complex than it appeared on surface. I chose honesty over comfort. Every time. Fear is information, Sophia. It tells you when stakes are high, when you need to be extra careful, when the situation demands your best attention. The difference between being brave and being stupid is that brave people feel the fear and do the necessary thing anyway. Stupid people don't feel the fear because they're not paying attention. My father made a sound that might have been agreement or surprise at the articulation. Grandpa says you're one of the bravest people he knows. Sophia looked between us. He talks about you differently now, like he's proud, but also sad about time he wasted. That's accurate. My father's admission came without defensiveness. I am proud, and I am sad. Both things are true. Can you fix sad with more proud? Sophia's question had the directness of childhood, cutting through adult complexity to core mechanisms. Sometimes. My father considered it seriously, treating her question with respect it deserved. If the proud is genuine and sustained, if it comes with real change in behavior, not just words. Your Aunt Kate is teaching me that actions matter more than apologies, that you have to keep doing the work of being better even when it's difficult. Sophia absorbed this, nodded. I'm going to remember that. When I mess up with people, I should do better, not just say better. Exactly. I caught my father's eye across the darkness, saw something pass between us, shared recognition that this child was learning lessons at 10, that he'd needed 7 decades to understand. The weekend extended itself naturally, no one rushing to end what was happening. Sunday morning, my mother made breakfast while Sophia and I went for a run along the neighborhood trails. She kept pace well, breathing controlled, asking questions between steps about training and preparation, and what it took to be ready for the kind of work I did. The physical stuff is important. I kept my pace easy so we could talk. Endurance, strength, being able to push through discomfort. But the mental preparation matters more. Learning to stay calm when everything is chaos, to make decisions with incomplete information, to trust your training when there's no time to overthink. How do you practice that? Start small. Put yourself in situations that are uncomfortable but not dangerous. Public speaking, leading group projects, doing things alone that feel scary. Each time you push through discomfort, you expand your capacity to handle harder things later. We ran in silence for a while, footfalls rhythmic on the packed dirt trail. Can I tell you something? Sophia's voice had gone quieter. Sometimes I feel like people at school don't understand me. Like they think I'm weird for caring about robotics and submarines more than boys and social media. The confession was vulnerable, trusting in a way that demanded careful response. That feeling never completely goes away. Even now, even doing work that matters, I don't fit neatly into categories people understand easily. But Sophia, here's what I've learned. Being understood by everyone is less important than being seen clearly by the people who matter. You don't need the whole school to get you. You need a few good friends who appreciate what makes you different, and family who supports who you actually are instead of who they wish you were. She ran faster suddenly, pushing the pace until we were sprinting the last 100 yards back to the house. When we stopped, both breathing hard, she had tears in her eyes, but was smiling. Thank you for seeing me, always. That's what adults who've been unseen owe to kids who are learning their own shape. Recognition that doesn't require them to change to earn it. Monday morning, I had to leave early to make it back to Virginia for evening briefings. The goodbyes carried different weight than previous departures. Less like abandonment and more like temporary absence before inevitable return. My father walked me to my car. I've enrolled in a mentorship program. Young officers, mostly women, who could benefit from someone helping them navigate career paths that weren't traditional when I was coming up. That's exactly right, Dad. He smiled, tentative but genuine. I figure if I can't change the past, at least I can influence the future, learn from failures with you, and do better with others. That's all any of us can do. Learn and adjust and keep trying. The drive back to Virginia gave me time to process, to sit with the strange reality that family relationships could actually evolve, given enough honesty and sustained effort. Change wasn't dramatic breakthrough, but accumulated small adjustments, daily choices to see differently and respond with updated understanding, rather than automatic patterns. My next deployment cycle was domestic. 3 months embedded with a joint task force at Camp Pendleton, working on integration protocols between different service branches. The work was important but less intense than overseas operations, which meant I could maintain more regular contact with family. Email exchanges with my mother became weekly, then twice weekly. She shared updates about her therapy progress, about insights she was having about her own mother, and how intergenerational patterns of anxiety and control had shaped parenting strategies she'd never questioned. I shared what I could about work challenges, about the frustration of bureaucracy and the satisfaction of solving complex coordination problems. My father sent articles and book recommendations, things he was reading that made him think about leadership or family dynamics or the evolution of military culture. His notes and margins had evolved from questions to observations, from seeking to understand to actively analyzing through frameworks he'd developed. Derek's emails came less frequently, but with more substance. Updates on Sophia's progress. She'd applied to the Naval Academy summer program and gotten in, one of 40 students selected nationwide. Updates on his own growth. He'd started a father-daughter engineering night at Sophia's school, creating space for girls interested in STEM to work on projects with parental support. The sustained effort across months demonstrated something words alone couldn't convey: that the changes weren't performative, weren't temporary adjustments made under pressure of guilt. They were actual reorientations, genuine attempts to build different patterns. In November, I took leave to attend the Veterans Gathering where my father was speaking. It happened at a community center in San Diego, maybe 60 people in attendance, mix of retired military and active duty, some family members, a few civilian supporters. The room was plain, folding chairs and a portable podium. Nothing fancy but functional. My father looked nervous in a way I'd rarely seen him. He'd spent his career speaking to rooms of people, delivering briefings and commands and assessments with the kind of authority that came from certainty. This was different. This required vulnerability. I'm here today to talk about failure. He started without preamble, voice steady but lacking his usual commanding presence. Specifically, my failure as a father, as a mentor, as someone who thought he understood leadership but was missing critical components. The room went quiet, attention sharpening as people realized this wasn't going to be standard inspirational veteran content. I have a daughter, Commander Catherine Mitchell, call sign Shadow 9. She serves at levels I can't discuss, doing work I'm not cleared to know about. She's been doing this for 17 years, and until 8 months ago, I had no idea. Not because she hid it from me, but because I never thought to look beyond my assumptions about who she was capable of being. He laid it out methodically: the pattern of dismissal, the preference for Derek, the way he'd filtered my achievements through expectations that made them invisible. He didn't spare himself, didn't soften the edges to make his failure more palatable. I thought I was a good father. I provided structure, discipline, support for my children's goals. But I only provided those things for the child whose goals I understood and valued. My daughter was standing right there, achieving extraordinary things, and I couldn't see her because I decided she didn't fit the template. Someone in the audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the kind of content people expected at veteran gatherings. Usually it was war stories or inspirational overcoming adversity narratives, not raw admission of domestic failure. My father noticed the discomfort but didn't adjust his message. I'm telling you this because I think I'm not alone. I think there are many of us who love our children but fail to see them clearly, who have daughters serving right now, doing exceptional work, and we're so focused on sons or on our own legacy or on outdated ideas about capability that we miss what's right in front of us. He talked about specifics then: the missed graduations, the dismissive responses, the years of treating my service as less important than Derek's, because his fit patterns I recognized. He talked about the briefing room moment when reality finally penetrated certainty, about the months since spent trying to understand and repair. I can't get those years back. I can't undo the hurt I caused by being blind when I should have been seeing. But what I can do is stand here and tell you, check your assumptions. Ask your daughters what they're actually doing, not what you think they're doing. Listen to answers without filtering them through your expectations. And if you discover you've been wrong, have the courage to admit it and do better. The speech lasted 20 minutes. When he finished, silence held for several seconds before scattered applause began, building into something sustained but different from typical veteran event applause, more thoughtful, less automatic. Afterward, people approached him with their own stories. Fathers who recognized themselves in his description, daughters who'd served without full family recognition, mothers who'd watched their daughters fight for visibility. The conversation sprawled across the next hour, everyone processing implications for their own relationships. One older man, probably in his 80s, waited until the crowd cleared before approaching. His voice shook with emotion. I had a daughter in the Army, intelligence specialist. I never understood what she did, never asked the right questions. She died 3 years ago. Car accident, nothing to do with service. But at her funeral, her commanding officer told me things about her career I'd never known. Awards she'd earned, operations she'd supported, lives she'd saved through analysis that prevented attacks. And I realized I'd missed knowing her completely, because I was too proud or too stupid to look past my assumptions. The old man wiped his eyes without embarrassment. Your daughter is alive. You have time. Don't waste it the way I did. My father embraced him, two old men holding each other in shared grief over different failures, shared hope for different possibilities. I waited by the car until he finished talking with everyone who wanted to speak with him. When he finally emerged, he looked exhausted, but lighter somehow, like confession had released weight he'd been carrying unconsciously. That was brave. I meant it without qualification. It was necessary. He unlocked the car but didn't get in immediately, stood with one hand on the door looking back at the community center. If telling my failure helps even one family avoid making the same mistakes, then something useful comes from the waste. The echo of my own words from months earlier, adopted and adapted through his own understanding. We drove back to my parents' house in silence that felt comfortable, companionable, rather than strained. Inside, my mother had prepared dinner. Just the three of us, intimate rather than the larger family gathering. We ate slowly, talking about small things and large things with equal attention. The quality of the tomatoes from the farmer's market, the geopolitical implications of recent naval deployments, the way light came through the kitchen window at this particular time of year. After dinner, my mother brought out a box I didn't recognize. Old photos, she explained, from her own childhood and early adulthood, including pictures of Margaret, the sister I'd never known existed until recently. I've been doing memory work with my therapist, confronting things I buried instead of processing. And I realized you should know about Margaret not just as cautionary tale for why I parented poorly, but as a person who would have appreciated you, who would have understood you in ways I failed to. She spread photos across the table. Margaret at various ages, serious child, determined teenager, focused young woman in medical school. The resemblance was striking, not physically, but in expression, in the way she held herself slightly apart even in group shots, observant rather than performing. She was brilliant and difficult and uncompromising. My mother traced one photo with her finger. Our parents didn't know how to support someone who refused to diminish herself for their comfort, and I watched what happened. The estrangement, the loneliness, the way she succeeded professionally but seemed isolated personally. When she died, I internalized the wrong lesson. I decided her choices had caused her pain, that if I could prevent you from making similar choices, I'd be protecting you. The mechanism laid bare, examined with the kind of clarity that only comes from sustained therapeutic work. But what I didn't understand was that her pain came from lack of support, not from her ambition itself. If our family had celebrated her strength instead of treating it as aberration, she wouldn't have had to choose between authenticity and connection. She looked at me directly. I forced you into the same choice. Be smaller and stay connected, or be yourself and expect distance. That was cruel even though I didn't intend cruelty. You're fixing it now. I kept my voice gently. That's what matters. My father reached across and took both our hands, completing a circuit. We're all fixing it now, learning what we should have known from the beginning, that love means seeing people clearly, not seeing them the way we wish they were. The moment held, three people who'd failed each other in different ways, choosing to build something better from the wreckage of old patterns and automatic assumptions. By December, the changes had settled into something sustainable, not perfect, still requiring conscious attention and course correction, but genuine rather than performative. My parents had integrated new behaviors into daily routines rather than treating them as exceptional efforts. Derek had created structures that supported Sophia's interests while also making space for Lucas's different needs. Ashley had found her own voice in advocating for family dynamics that served everyone rather than just being easier for parents. I received orders for a new assignment, Pearl Harbor, 2-year posting to Indo-Pacific Strategic Advisory Board. It was a promotion in everything but formal title, recognition that my particular skill set had value in shaping regional strategy rather than just executing tactical operations. The notification came with another piece of news: early promotion to full commander, O5 rank, 2 years ahead of typical timeline. Captain Chen called personally to deliver the information. Shadow 9, you've earned this 10 times over. The only reason it took this long is because your work doesn't generate the kind of visible metrics that promotion boards typically use, but the right people know. And they're making sure you're recognized. Thank you, Captain, for everything, for seeing me when I was barely visible to myself, for guiding me toward work that matched capabilities I was still discovering. That's what good mentors do. And now you pay it forward. You'll have opportunities in Hawaii to shape younger officers' trajectories. Do for them what I tried to do for you. See them clearly and help them become fully themselves. After we hung up, I sat with the promotion paperwork, processing what it meant. Not just career advancement, but validation that the path I'd chosen, the years of operating in shadow, had led somewhere substantial. I'd built a career on being invisible. And somehow that invisibility had created its own form of impact. I called my family to share the news. My father answered, and I could hear the gathering in the background. My mother, Derek's family. They were all together for Sunday dinner that had become weekly tradition. Dad, I have news. I'm being promoted to full commander and reassigned to Hawaii for 2 years. Strategic advisory role, significant increase in responsibility. The sound of phone being switched to speaker, everyone gathering around. Catherine, that's wonderful. My mother's voice carried pure joy, no complication of worry or fear. Hawaii for 2 years? That's exciting! Congratulations, Kate. Derek's enthusiasm was genuine, no undertone of competition or comparison. That's a huge deal, we're proud of you. Sophia's voice cut through, clear and excited. Does this mean you'll be even closer to submarines? Hawaii has a big submarine presence at Pearl Harbor. It does mean that. Though I still can't talk about most of what I'll be doing. I know, classified, but still cool. My father's voice came last, thick with emotion he didn't try to hide. Commander Mitchell, that's an honor you've earned many times over. I'm proud of you. So incredibly proud. Thanks, Dad. That means something. When I come to Hawaii, can I visit? Sophia again, persistent as always. Mom and Dad said maybe we could do a family vacation there this summer. The idea of my family coming to where I lived, making effort to be part of my world rather than expecting me to always fit into theirs, that represented shift profound enough to take my breath slightly. I'd love that. We'll make it happen. The call ended with promises to coordinate details, to find time before my departure to gather in person one more time. I sat in my quiet apartment, phone in hand, processing the strange reality that I had both family and career, that I didn't have to choose between being seen at work and being invisible at home. The years of operating in shadow had taught me to value internal knowing over external recognition. But there was something powerful about having both, knowing my own worth and having it reflected back by people who mattered, by family who'd learned to see me, and by colleagues who'd always recognized my capabilities. I looked at the framed photo of Commander Chen on my shelf, at the woman who'd seen me clearly when I was still learning to see myself. Pulled out my phone and sent a text. Thank you for everything. About to do for others what you did for me. Her response came within minutes. That's the whole point, Shadow 9. That's how we change the world, one clearly seen person at a time. I packed methodically over the next week, sorting what would come to Hawaii and what would stay in storage. Sophia's submarine book went in the keep pile, along with the compass Commander Chen had given me and the folded flag from Grandmother Mitchell's funeral. Physical objects that carried weight beyond their material form, reminders of people who'd seen me when being seen mattered most. The final gathering before my departure happened at Derek's house. Both families, grandparents, Ashley's parents, who I'd met only briefly before, but who welcomed me warmly now. Lucas showed off soccer trophies, while Sophia presented her summer program application to the Naval Academy, with the kind of pride that suggested she already knew she'd been accepted, but was waiting for official confirmation. My father gave me a gift, a leather journal with brass corners, practical and handsome, for documenting what you can't share officially, but might want to remember personally. Every officer needs a place to process what the official record can't capture. Inside the front cover, he'd written an inscription in his careful handwriting. To Commander Catherine Mitchell, Shadow 9. May you always know your own worth, regardless of who sees it. And may those of us lucky enough to call you family continue learning to see you with the clarity you deserve. With love and pride, Dad. The evening stretched into night, conversation and laughter flowing naturally. At one point, I found myself on the patio with just Sophia, both of us looking at stars barely visible through suburban light pollution. Aunt Kate? When you were my age, did you know you do what you do now? No. I considered lying but chose truth. When I was your age, I was trying to figure out how to be seen at all. What I did wasn't as intentional as people might think. I just kept choosing authenticity over approval, kept doing work that mattered, even when it meant being invisible. But you're not invisible anymore. Sophia's observation was simple, factual, not to the people who matter. And that's what I'm learning. You don't need everyone to see you. You need the right people to see you clearly. She nodded, processing. I'm going to remember that. When things get hard or people don't understand, I'll remember that being seen by the right people is enough. We sat in silence, watching as more stars became visible as our eyes adjusted to darkness. Small lights that had always been there, but required patience and attention to perceive.